Hello everybody and welcome back to the Learning Academy. Now a few years ago, when I was really only just starting out making lessons on A-level history, I did a sort of guide to the various different exam questions for the AQA syllabus. This being obviously the extract questions, the source questions, and then the essay questions. And I thought what I would do is an update of this kind of video, because those are very, very old videos. They're not particularly well explained, in my opinion, at least compared to the kind of explanations that we're going to do in this lesson. And so that's what I want to do here. This is going to represent something of a complete guide to the writing of the extract questions for A-level history for the AQA syllabus. And what we're going to do is an extract questions video, we'll do a source questions video, and then we'll do an essays questions video, and then we will round it off and finish it off by doing a basic how-to study guide, how to revise and how to get an A star, or an A or an A star for those of you who are looking to doing your exams in May and June. So what we're going to do is analyse the purpose of the extract question, because I feel like this is sometimes lost on a lot of the students. They're thinking, why am I doing this? What's the point in these extract questions? I feel like if you know the purpose of the extract questions, what people, or at least the syllabus, the examiners are looking for and what they are trying to get out of you, then you will get to be able to understand the purpose of the question a little bit better. We'll also talk about how to answer extract questions as well, and then getting the top marks and getting some top tips at the end of this video as well. So it's going to be quite a long video. We're going to analyze it, and we're going to use one example, unfortunately, because this is going to be quite long in and of itself. If you really, really, really want me to do this kind of video, but using other syllabuses, using other topics, then let me know, because this is going to be an extract question that is taken from the Tudors topic, which is one of the most popular. But if you want me to do an extract question from Tsarist and Communist Russia, the British Empire, Stuart Britain, Crisis of the Monarchy, etc., then do let me know, because I understand that for some people you aren't doing this topic. But I still believe that even if you are not doing this topic, you will get quite a lot of value out of it anyway, okay? Because the only thing that is different between this topic and the topic that you're doing is that the facts are different and that the subject is different. Maybe you are talking about the Russian Revolution in your topic and not talking about Henry VIII, okay? But the fundamental underlying principles are exactly the same. So let's begin then. What are the extract questions? Well, these are the questions which are the required questions for your Paper 1 exams. So when you do AQA A-level history, you will do 2 exams, and then there'll be a piece of coursework which is not relevant to this conversation at the moment. You'll have 2 exams, okay? You have Paper 1, which is often at the end of May, and then Paper 2, which is often a week later in June. Paper 1 is your breadth paper. It is examining a quite large period of history, and it is examining a large period of history, and you're going to use extract questions in Paper 1, whereas Paper 2 requires you to analyse source questions, which is taking a primary source and then examining the validity of that primary source and how useful that primary source is to a historian studying that topic. We'll get to that in a different video. So you will notice that if you have a look at your whichever 2 topics that you are doing, the Paper 1 topics will have 1 and then the letter which is associated with it. So if you're doing the Crusades, it's 1A. If you're doing Spain in the Age of Discovery, it's 1B. If you're doing the Tudors, it's 1C, etc., etc., etc. If you're doing the Paper 2, it will be 1A, which is, I believe, the Angevin Empire, or 1B, or 1C, etc., etc., etc. Sorry, 2B. 2A, 2B, and 2C. Now, you'll notice that the Paper 1 time period is quite long. It's over 100 years, whereas the Paper 2 time period is often a bit smaller. It's about 40 or 50 years. For reference, when I was doing the A-level AQA syllabus back when it first started in 2016, I was the first year to do this topic. It's been nearly 10 years since this topic has this new syllabus has entered in. I did the Tudors, which is a period of roughly 100 years, 1485 to 1603, and I did Democracy and Nazism, which is Weimar and Nazi Germany, which is about 30 or 40 years, 1918 to 1945, or even less than that, in fact. And so that's why you have a difference. You have a breadth paper, you have a depth paper. The first paper is trying to examine a long period of history, looking at the change and continuity over time, looking at broad themes that takes place over quite long stretches of history, whereas paper 2 is looking at real detail in specific periods of history, looking at quite major tumultuous periods of history. Often the paper 2 topics cover things like the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or even the rise and fall of the Third Reich, for example. Now, what the extract questions are requiring you to do is for you to examine 3 extracts, or 2 extracts if you are only doing the AS topic, but for the most part, if you're doing A level, it'll be 3 extracts. And you are picking out arguments that are made in each of them. So the extracts themselves are taken from works of historical text. So history books, maybe papers, academic papers that are written by historians. And really the point of the extract question is, as the specification states, to test students' ability to analyze and evaluate the view of historians. Now, this is your AO3 assessment, okay? This is area of assessment number 3, which tells you that for a student, they have to be able to analyze and evaluate, in relation to the historical context, different ways in which aspects of the past have been interpreted. Okay, so you're not talking necessarily about the primary sources and taking things that have been written at the time. You're in fact taking what people have written about the history. You're taking historians and their views and their opinions and their arguments, and you're seeing, well, how good are these arguments? How convincing are these arguments? Well, I'm going to analyze these arguments by using my knowledge of historical context. That's fundamentally the purpose of an extract question. According to the specification, what is required is that there will be 3 extracts provided, each of them containing historical interpretations linked to a broad issue or development. Okay, that broad issue or development will be essentially the subject of the question. The question that you are going to be asked is asking, using your understanding of historical context, how convincing the arguments are in relation to this broad issue or development. So it may be in relation to the motivations of Vladimir Lenin, for example, or the extent to which Henry VII consolidated his authority, or the causes of the English Revolution or the English Civil War, etc., etc., etc. Students will be required to identify the arguments and evaluate them. In doing so, they must apply knowledge and understanding of the historical context to these arguments and interpretations. Deployment of knowledge that does not relate to these extracts will receive no credits. So if you are, for example, asked to write an extract question on Henry VIII, and you start talking about Elizabeth I, then you're not going to get any credit, unless it's in relation to Henry VIII, which is unlikely. You won't get any credit. If you are even more lost and you are asked to write a question about Henry VIII and you end up starting to write about the Russian Revolution, that's very, very, very much something that you won't get any credit for either, okay? But what is interesting here is that it is asking you to essentially do 2 things, okay? The first is step 1, which is to be able to identify the arguments in the extracts. You have to be able to pick the arguments out of the extracts. And that can sometimes be quite difficult to do, and something that will probably take practice over time in order for you to get better and better at doing so. But then the second point is, once you have picked those arguments out, you have to think, right, how convincing are these arguments? So let's use an example to work through. And like I said, we're taking an example from the Tudors, which is option 1C. The Tudors from 1485 to 1603, the Battle of Bosworth to the death of Elizabeth. Now, this is the question. The question is, using your understanding of historical context, assess how convincing the arguments in these three extracts are in relation to religious changes from the late 1520s to the death of Henry VIII. This is taken from the November 2020 exam. So you'll notice that it is asking you to assess how convincing the arguments are in relation to quite a broad question: religious changes from the late 1520s, okay? It doesn't specify exactly which date is the cutoff point, which is quite nice, okay? So you're probably thinking 1525 onwards, all the way to 1547, which is the death of Henry VIII. So that's roughly the period that you are thinking about. And it is, like I said, quite broad. Religious changes. Well, there's a lot of religious, for those who do the Tudors topic, there is a lot of religious changes that takes place in that period. Now, I'm going to go do one extract because this will take a very long time to work through, but essentially what you would do is duplicate this for each of the other extracts as well. So the extract itself is extract A from the November 2020 exam period. Oh no, sorry, not November. Sorry, the May 2020 exam period. Apologies, just a citation error there. And this is a piece of text that is adapted from J. Bernard in their book from 2005, The King's Reformation. Now the extract says the following. It says that Henry VIII was the dominant force in the making of what is best called the King's Reformation. Religious policy was essentially the king's. Henry saw himself as God's lieutenant, whose divinely ordained mission was to purify the church. In the campaign for the divorce, in the break with Rome, in the making of the articles of religion, in the dissolution of the monasteries, and sometimes in the destruction of opponents, Henry's role was full and decisive. Henry overcame substantial opposition from Thomas More and from John Fisher, from the bishops, and from the Pilgrimage of Grace. What the king sought, he largely achieved. Time and again, Henry was cautious in pursuing his aims, not least over the break with Rome itself. He not only found highly able servants to carry out his wishes, Cromwell, Cranmer, Norfolk, but also managed to get them to take the blame for what was done. Okay? So, the first thing you have to do when you get a question like this, you are in an exam, you open up the exam question, you have to find the arguments. Now, when we get to the top tips section in a little later, I'll note that one of the things you have to do is to read the extracts. You'll be amazed how many people don't read the extracts and just sort of skim it or whatever. Read it. Take it in, try and work out what's being said. They're often not very complicated. If you have to, read it twice, read it 3 times. You may be thinking that, well, I'm not writing, I'm wasting time, but you will thank yourself in the long run by reading it and reading it again, making sure that you truly understand what is being said. So, what I've done here is I've highlighted in different highlights all of the different arguments that I've picked out, okay? Now, what I should note is that when you go to the mark scheme, it will say, when it looks at the content that could be picked out for this particular question, it says, quote, "Note, this content is not prescriptive, and students are not obliged to refer to the material contained in this mark scheme. Any legitimate answer will be assessed on its merits according to the generic levels scheme." So note, the point of noting here is that the mark scheme will contain arguments that students may have referred to, but it doesn't contain every single argument necessarily, okay? It is a non-exhaustive list of things that you could say. There may be other things that you could say, other arguments that you could pick out that are not in the mark scheme, that are still valid and are still correct, okay? So just be aware of that. It's not like A-level maths where there is a single answer and there's like 1 or 2 potential ways of getting to that answer. It's quite open-ended, it's quite subjective. So, this is the source question the exact same extract, not the source question, the same extract that I've taken from the previous slide, but I've highlighted different points here, okay? Some of which are good arguments, some of which are bad arguments, or some of which are potentially valid arguments or not valid arguments. The point is to just get used to and get good at being able to pick out which arguments are in here, okay? It doesn't even necessarily mean that you're going to talk about every single one of these arguments, because like we've said here, like I say here, look, there's very little that even isn't an argument. I've picked out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've picked out 6 different arguments, and you're not going to have time to write and discuss and analyze 6 different arguments for 3 different extracts. You just don't have time to do that. So you don't have to use all of these arguments, but just make sure you have an idea of which you are picking out. So that's step 1, okay? I've picked out a few arguments. We've got the first argument here being that Henry VIII was the dominant force in the making of what is best called the King's Reformation. Henry saw himself as God's lieutenant, divinely ordained mission to purify the church. In the campaign, if anything, to be frank, this big dark red highlighted point here could even be 2 arguments. You've got the first one being the first sentence, that Henry saw himself as God's lieutenant, and then the second argument could have been in the campaign for the divorce, break from Rome, blah 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 blah. Henry's role was full and decisive. You could have even split that into 2 itself. Okay. He overcame substantial opposition. Okay, this is another argument, and the author references different examples of that. So Thomas More, John Fisher, Bishop's Pilgrimage of Grace. What the king sought, he largely achieved. Again, that's another argument that you can make and that you can analyze. Time and again, Henry was cautious in pursuing his aims, not least over the break from Rome itself. Again, another argument. Whether or not he was cautious, and whether or not he was especially cautious in relation to the break from Rome. And then finally, you've got the last one, having able servants, and then they cite Cromwell, Cranmer, and Norfolk. So those are the arguments, okay? And whether or not you picked out all of these arguments, if you were following along with this video, is irrelevant, okay? As long as you can pick out at least 3 potential arguments, and then you are pretty good. And often you might find that when you read these extracts, you might think, well, I have no idea where to even begin with this question. I don't understand anything. But then if you just read it again, you think, well, hang on, there's an argument that I could use, and there's an argument I can use, and you just get better and better as you develop over time. So what the mark scheme does is identify 4 major arguments that this extract identifies, some of which I've also identified myself. So they say that Bernard argues that religious change took place as the result of Henry's actions. It was the King's Reformation, which is the point that is the first line, essentially. The second is that Bernard argues that Henry regarded himself as God's lieutenant, doing God's work. That's the second argument that I've highlighted there in dark red. Bernard argues that it was Henry who overcame opposition to religious change. Again, this is the green highlight there. Henry overcame substantial opposition, blah, 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 and gave it lots of examples. And then finally, Bernard argues that Henry not only got people to do his work, but he also got them to take the blame for what was done. That is the final in red, okay? So what the mark scheme doesn't take and doesn't pick out is the blue argument, the what the king sought, he largely achieved, and also the purple argument, the time and again Henry was cautious. Again, that's not necessarily suggesting that if you had picked those arguments out that you would have been wrong, okay, and that you wouldn't have got any marks for that, but just that the mark scheme picked out ones that weren't there, okay, that weren't those arguments at least. Now, so that's part 1. You've picked out your arguments, okay? Now what do you have to do? Well, what you have to do is you have to write about those arguments, okay? You have to use your understanding of historical context, so use what's in your brain, all of your knowledge of the history, okay? And then you have to assess how convincing these arguments are. And the way in which you're assessing how convincing these arguments are is in relation to religious changes, okay? So, again, broad conversation, religious changes from around the 1520s to the death of Henry VIII. The point is to assess whether or not the arguments presented by the historians are convincing. And one way I used to always understand this is, imagine yourself, you are a historian yourself, and you've been given this work by Bertrand, and you are asked to review this work by Bertrand. Okay? Well, what you would do is you would look at the things that Bertrand claims, you would look at the arguments, and you'd go, well, hang on a minute, is that right? Is that correct? I know about the history because I'm also a historian. So I'm gonna analyze it. Okay, this argument says this, but is that necessarily correct? Does the history actually support the argument? That's the essential point. That's essentially what you are doing. You are being asked to see if those are the arguments that are being presented are factual, if they are good, they're convincing arguments. Okay, now. The word assessing is very important when we think about this, because when you assess an argument, you're not necessarily just saying, oh, the argument is good or it's bad, or the argument is convincing or unconvincing. That's not the point, okay? You can be a little bit more nuanced about it. And I feel like a lot of students often get themselves trapped into a situation where they feel like they have to regard the argument as convincing or unconvincing, and therefore they get really, really stuck because they don't know how to argue against the claim that was made by the historian. So you should be able to assess the arguments, not just to provide an account of why it is or isn't convincing. And what you can do there, and what that means is that you open the door to saying all kinds of different things, okay? So you should be able to provide evidence which maybe supports its validity, but why it is not completely convincing. So what do I mean by this? And I'll give some examples of how you can do this, how you can assess an argument, and then I'll also give examples of how the mark scheme assesses the arguments that are cited in this extract, in this particular question itself. Okay, so like I said, often a student will take an argument that is in an extract and they will try to think in their brain evidence that means that the argument is correct and evidence that means that the argument is wrong. That's not necessarily how you should do it, okay? What you should do is think about all of the factors that exist in the history, the historical context. The context is what's most important. You could maybe argue that while the claim that is made by Bertrand is not necessarily wrong, it lacks context, or it is overly simplistic, or other historians take a different interpretation. These are all ways in which you can assess an argument. So you could say, for example, one way of assessing an argument is to say, well, this argument that Bertrand makes is correct, okay, but it's lacking context. It doesn't mention another thing that also happened in the history. It doesn't explain why this is the case. It is too simplistic in its explanation of the events. These are all ways in which you can assess the argument. And then if you use your specific knowledge, if you use your knowledge of historical context to support that view, to support the claim that you are making, then that's how you get those really top marks, okay? Let's take an example from the mark scheme. So the mark scheme has a couple of things. The argument in question that the mark scheme is referring to is this bit of the extract. So Henry VIII, was the dominant force in the making of what is best called the King's Reformation. Religious policy was essentially the King's. Henry saw himself as God's lieutenant, whose divinely ordained mission was to purify the church in campaign with the etc., 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 break from Rome, etc. So this is what the mark scheme says in relation to this argument. And they say it in their assessment as to the extent to which the argument is convincing, okay? And they say here that Bertrand is convincing in arguing that break with Rome was done in the name of the king and provided a solution to the king's great matter. However, there are those who would suggest that he was manipulated by Cromwell and would not have broken with Rome had the solution to the king's great matter have been found. So what is this suggesting here? It is suggesting that he is convincing Bernard is convincing in the argument that is being presented that the break from Rome was in the king's name and the solution to the king's great matter. That is a point that you can start talking about the king's great matter. The king's great matter was a very personal issue that the king had, of course. For those who don't know, the king's great matter was the divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He married Catherine of Aragon, he wanted to marry somebody else, and then obviously getting the divorce through meant to break from Rome. It took firstly Thomas Wolsey and then Thomas Cromwell to actually get this to be achieved. That's the very short story that we have that I've just explained here. But the second part is what's most important, because what the Marx scheme has done is assessed that argument. They've said on the one hand, it is convincing, because the break from Rome was done for the king's great matter. It provided a solution to the king's great matter. And so it was done, and so this supports the view that this was Henry's actions, and this was him doing God's work, etc., etc., etc. However, there are those who would suggest that he was manipulated by Cromwell and would not have broken with Rome had the solution to the great matter have been found. This is something, this bit that's highlighted in red, is a point that is not made by Bernard. It is a point that is left out by Bernard. It is not part of the context in which he is speaking, he is writing in his extract. So this is how you can assess it. On the one hand, it's convincing because it was done in the King's Great Matter, but on the other hand, it's a little bit less convincing because it doesn't exactly, in and of itself, provide the context of everything. And some argue that, to an extent, Cromwell may have manipulated the king, and there could have been a case that had the King's Great Matter had been solved without a break from Rome, there would not have been a break from Rome in the first place. So the green is why the argument is convincing, and then the red is assessing how the argument is convincing, okay, or assessing how convincing the argument is. This is one of the things that it's almost like a shift in your brain that really opens the door to all of the different opportunities that you can do to think about how to analyze extracts. So instead of just saying, well, it was convincing because this, and that, but it's not convincing because this, and that, you say it's convincing, but then you argue why it maybe lacks context, or maybe the points that are left out, or maybe suggesting that it is oversimplistic, and or even argue that there are some other historians that would say this and that would say that. Those are the ways in which you can assess how convincing an argument is. This is what the Marx scheme, the generic Marx scheme, says for these questions. This is the level 5 response. I assume we all want to get level 5 responses, 25 to 30 marks. That's the sort of A star range. And it says that you show a very good understanding of the interpretations put forward in all three extracts, and combines this with strong awareness of the historical context to analyze and evaluate interpretations given in the extract. Evaluation of the arguments are well supported and convincing, and the response demonstrates a good understanding of context. So you have to firstly understand what the interpretations are, what the arguments that are being presented are. If you don't understand what the arguments that are being made in each of the extracts are, then you're not going to get very good marks. That's why I always recommend you read the extract multiple times to get a good understanding of what the historian is saying. The next point is that you combine your understanding of what they're arguing with an awareness of the historical context to analyze and evaluate the interpretations given in the extracts. And then you will be supporting those evaluations with good understanding of historical context, Now, you might find that there are instances, that there are examples where a particular argument that is being picked out by in your exam, you might find that it's not convincing at all. You might be like, well, this sentence here, this argument that is written here is very poor. It's not very convincing at all. There are all of these points that can be argued to go against this particular point, and that's perfectly fine. There's no one-size-fits-all for these kinds of questions. Often, another thing that students like to do, a lot of them in my comment sections, is to ask, well, how many paragraphs am I supposed to do? Do I have to do an agree and a disagree, and then another agree and another disagree? And the answer to these questions is it doesn't actually matter, okay? You can pick out Someone could pick out and write about 6 arguments in an extract and get a B or a C. Or you could pick out 2 or 3 arguments and get an A star, because it's not just, there's no one size fits all. And so it's about the level of quality that you are essentially implementing in your essay question, in your question itself, in your extract question, should I say. And the amount of historical context, the way in which you showing how much you understand the particular extract question, to the way you understand what the historian is saying, and the way you can put that argument into the historical context and assess whether or not it is good or it is bad. And you will find that pretty much the way these extract questions are made is essentially in a way that allows you to have a good little debate in your essay. Okay, it allows for you to make points on both sides of the argument. You can make points as to why it's convincing. You can make points as to why there is a lacking of context, and you can then go on to explain what that context is. You can then make points as to why it is potentially not as convincing, etc., etc., etc. You will not very rarely find an extract question where it is just citing fact after fact after fact after fact, because then that's not very useful, okay? If a historian argues that Henry VIII died in 1547, then there's not really anything that you can say about that, because that is just a fact of the matter, that is just true. But rather, they're making arguments, okay, that about the character of a person. They're making arguments about what caused an event. They're making arguments about which events are more significant than other events. And that's really where you can have a historical debate. That's what history is all about. It is about having debates about the things that happened in the past, and the ways that those things explain and influence other things, the value of those things, why those things happened, how those things happened, could those things predict what things could happen in the future. That's all a historian does. That's what a historian exists to do and writes about. So in this final section, I'm just going to give a few top tips. Okay, the first thing you should do is when you sit down in your exam, you've written your name, your student code or whatever they're called. You get told, okay, turn your papers over. You read the extracts carefully, and you read them fully before even thinking about writing anything. You have about an hour to write up these extract questions, okay, and the source questions on paper 2. So just take your time, okay? If you feel like you struggle with being able to write the things you want to write in the time that is necessary, then practice writing essay questions under timed conditions. Practice writing quickly, learning just very slowly how to pick out arguments quickly, how to analyze those arguments quickly. Do it all under timed exam conditions. The best revision you can possibly do is to practice questions, okay? It is to practice and practice and practice and practice. And once you've practiced all the things, you go and you've done all the exam questions that there are available to you, all the past paper questions, all of the textbook questions, you go back and do them again, okay? But maybe you do them again under time conditions, or you do them again without your textbook available to you, or you go and find extracts, or you get your teacher to find extracts for you to look through. You go and read a book on this topic, and you just highlight arguments that are written in the book to get used to and practice all of these different things. Okay, anyway, that's a side point. So first tip, read the extract question as carefully as possible. Make sure you have a very good understanding of what is being said, and then while you are reading, maybe read it once, okay? Don't do anything, just read it once, and then read it again. But when you've read it again, this second time you're reading it, you use your pen and you underline each of the arguments you can pick out. If you practice this enough, like I've just said, if you practice enough and get used to reading past paper questions, you'll find that it's actually quite easy to pick out arguments. And the more you know about a topic, the more you know about the historical context, the more you can underline a sentence and go, oh, I can say something about that. And so you might find that, like I did when I did this exam question and I highlighted it, that pretty much all of the extract contains arguments that you could use. I found 6 arguments that I could potentially have written about in an exam question. The mark scheme only found 4. So you will end up finding loads, okay? You end up basically underlining and highlighting every single different part of the extract. The final point is take 3 of those. Just take 3. You don't have to take all of them. Just take 3 and spend a good amount of time explaining why they are or not convincing given the historical context. And generally speaking, the structure of these extract questions will probably mimic something of just very big, 3 very big paragraphs. Okay, a big paragraph for extract 1, a big paragraph for extract 2, and a big paragraph for extract 3, where you go into the depth of each of those, pick them out, add in your historical context, argue why there is and isn't convincing, which parts are convincing, which parts aren't convincing, which parts do align with the historical context, which parts are lacking historical context, which parts are overly simplistic, which parts are not even are true or false, all of these different things. Okay, and again, the final tip I would say is, right now, I'm recording this lesson on the 25th of March, 2024. Your exam on this topic is at the end of May. Just do practice questions. Practice. From now, do practice questions, and you will get the highest grade, I promise. So, this has just been a very basic overview, a basic guide. Like I said earlier on, if you want me to do this for other topics, if you want me to do this for the for the British Empire topic or for the Tsarist and Communist Russia, do let me know. I'll do something similar to that. Potentially not as long as this, but I'll do something similar. And then stay tuned for the other videos that we'll do on the source questions, and then finally on essay questions.